must learn. You must learn. You must learn. It's calm
This
yet
is the period which we call the Ethiopian Holocaust. Now, every time people usually hear the Holocaust, they automatically think of what took place in Europe. And we want to draw attention to Ethiopia. There was an Ethiopian Holocaust that took place. And the events that led up to why that Holocaust took place, most people aren't aware of. If you go back to the latter part of the 1800s, you'll find what took place is they had what's known as, in 1885, they had the Berlin Conference. Now, the Berlin Conference is basically where the Europeans decided to come and colonize Africa and to take advantage of the natural resources that were in Africa. So at that time, for instance, you had many Europeans rush into the continent of Africa to take advantage and to slay the people and to colonize the people and to put them in slavery. And they found out that we all have to share in this profit. So, for instance, the south part of Africa, which was at one time known as Monomatapa, now you know it as South Africa, that was given to the Dutch. And there were parts like, let's say, the Congo. The Congo was given to the Belgians. So each of these European countries were to take part in this partitioning of Africa. There was only 2 African countries that survived this and that were never colonized under the Berlin Conference in the partitioning of Africa. One was Liberia, 2 was Ethiopia. And Ethiopia itself, I want to concentrate on that because Ethiopia is considered the cradle of civilization. Now, after the so-called conquering of Africa, as they say, what took place was you had the Italians. The Italians had took a stronghold in Eritrea and Somaliland, which you know is Somalia today. And they wanted to go into Ethiopia and to wage war with the Ethiopians. Now, you got to figure out this. This is something you got to keep in mind, that Europeans, how they were able to dominate the continent of Africa is Europeans use what's called the paper contract. The Africans, in contrast to that, they had a sheikh or a verbal agreement. In Africa, things were based on what we know as the word. And that's why in their own Bible they have, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. Well, the Word was bond, and your word is what we identified with. And if we said that we're going to, let's say, connect with you or to share certain resources with you, my word is all you needed. Europeans, on the other hand, they had to have it in writing. So what they basically did was the Italians basically came into Ethiopia and they tried to make Ethiopia an Italian protectorate, basically meaning that they would be in control of it. And who was in rulership at the time was Menelik. And Menelik, as you know, comes from the Solomonic dynasty or the Solomonic lineage. You should go and research these things. This was a certain dynasty that took place in what we know as the Ethiopia. And Menelik basically started signing over things, not really understanding what it was all about. And they felt, I think it was the Treaty of Wakale, they say it is, and they said once they had that treaty, the Italians, they went off and said, now we control Ethiopia. And this was, like I said, in the latter part of the 1800s, about let's say 89 or 86. And they felt like they took control. And Menelik said, basically, you don't control anything in Ethiopia. And as a result, they waged war and they staged an attack. And this was called the Battle of Adwa. They staged an attack against the Ethiopians, but one thing that they didn't take into consideration is that the Ethiopians themselves were a military power. And they underestimated that, and they were totally annihilated at the Battle of Adwa. And they never really recovered from that. Once they did recover from it, years later, they would stage an unprovoked attack, and this would be known as the Ethiopian Holocaust. So they were defeated at that point, and remember, at that point, that was the largest defeat of what we know as Europeans from Africans since the time of Hannibal. Hannibal was the one who controlled what we know as Carthage. He controlled their military, and he was an indigenous African, as they would say. So this was the largest defeat since the time of Hannibal, if you know your history. Of course, we'll get to that if you need it. So years later, in 1935, from 1889 to 1935, they kept having meetings saying that they wanted to avenge Ethiopia for this loss. So in 1935, at the time, you had Benito Mussolini and a fascist organization existing in Italy. So basically what they were saying was, you know what, we're going to avenge this. We're going to take revenge. And what they did was they staged an unprovoked attack on Ethiopia. They came in and they totally were trying to annihilate the population. They were unsuccessful at first until 6 days after they staged that attack. The League of Nations, of which the Ethiopians were a part of, they condemned these attacks and they started to impose certain minor, what we call as sanctions. The sanctions really didn't work. You know, these were minor sanctions at best. So basically, they realized that they couldn't actually defeat them, so they started using mustard gas. When they started using mustard gas, that was against the law. That was against policy, because after World War I, the League of Nations said, you're not allowed to use mustard gas in war. But they used mustard gas anyway, and this was in 1935 all the way up until 1941. This is called the Ethiopian Holocaust. Many people are not aware of it because most of the people that were responsible for this Holocaust were never brought up on charges, the same way that the Japanese, as well as other groups, have brought up charges against Europeans for what we know as the European Holocaust. The charges were never brought up on these individuals, and up to this day, no charges were ever brought up. By using mustard gas, that was, of course, like I said, against the League of Nations policy. So basically, they went in and they tried to annihilate the population of Ethiopia. This was the fascist Italians under Mussolini. And basically, none of them were brought up on charges of war crime. And in Europe, they brought them up on charges, war crime charges. This was called the Nuremberg trials. And they took the many men that were responsible for the atrocities committed against the Jews, they brought them up on war crimes. But Ethiopia went to the League of Nations. Haile Selassie, who was the emperor at the time of Ethiopia, he went to the League of Nations and addressed them, right? And this was in 1936, and told them about the Italians using mustard gas, and the League of Nations basically turned a blind eye. They really didn't do anything, and they really didn't have the back of the Ethiopians. You understand what I'm saying? So the point being is that when the Holocaust has taken place, we should never forget the Holocaust that took place in Ethiopia. There was a Holocaust that took place, and this was with the Italians from 1935 to 1941. And every time that the Jews are keeping the memory of the Holocaust alive, I say they should, because it was a great loss of life. But there was also at the same time a great loss of life on the continent in the country of Ethiopia. And we should never forget our history. Never ever forget your history. And you, a black man and black woman, you should always remember your history. And now that you're made aware of this, you should go and do some research. There's a great book called War Crimes of Ethiopia by Sylvia Pankhurst. And you should go and research that book. And you should go to your local community. You should go to your city council building. And you should go, that's usually where they have these celebrations of Jews who remember the Holocaust. And you should make sure that you march in there and you tell them, we want the Ethiopian Holocaust remembered. So never forget your history. Never ever forget your history.
You must learn.